with you about ensuring that your DE&I tech actually drives diversity. It's a critical part of every organization's HR journey right now to make sure that the DE&I tech you're employing isn't just paying lip service to the problem, but is actually working towards a solution. So my goal with this presentation today is in 40 minutes or less to try to help you guys be educated consumers of the technology that you're going to have to acquire to make sure that your organization can push forward their DE&I initiatives. So why am I the one talking with you today? In my current life, I am the COO and head of analytics for Cangrade. I have over 15 years of experience researching and championing issues of diversity and equity and inclusion, not just in the tech world, but in the public and nonprofit sectors as well. My doctoral work in graduate school was around understanding and addressing these issues inside of police departments in particular. But I've worked on all kinds of different social problems all over the world at this point, trying to understand how to push forward the goals of diversity, equity, inclusion, both within an organization and using that organization as an instrument of change. I've worked in Silicon Valley, I've run social research organizations, I've worked inside nonprofits, running strategic impact initiatives, but always that push has been the same. How can we leverage data to solve important social problems? And how can we make sure that tech and this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion being at the forefront of an organization are represented? You don't have to work in a nonprofit space to be part of a solution to making our space and our world a more equitable place. That's something that starts from within the private sector, I think. And that was why ultimately I chose to return to the private sector. And that's, I think, why you're all here today, pushing for DE&I within your organizations and being champions of that change that you want to see from the inside. So what's one of the biggest challenges facing HR today? Launching successful DE&I initiatives. Anyone can launch a DE&I initiative. It's the successful bit that's critical and the successful bit that's hard. So again, today my goal is to help you champion good technology and make sure that whatever solutions you end up using in your organizations for DE&I, that they are actually going to deliver for you. So let's take a quick poll now. I think make sure everyone's still with me at this point. Here's the poll. You can see the answers pop up on the screen. I can't vote, so this one's all you guys. Has your organization faced, or does it anticipate facing, a roadblock in launching a successful DE&I initiative? So yes, you've had at least one roadblock so far. No, you haven't yet, but you anticipate having one. Or no, it's been smooth sailing. You're one of the lucky ones. Give you guys a minute.
All right, many folks have responded, so I'm going to close the poll and share it with you, Leanna.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, so this shows you that you are not alone. if you're struggling in launching your DE&I initiative, it's 11% of you are the lucky ones, and everybody else either has already had an issue or is anticipating having an issue. Launching a good DE&I initiative is not simple, both because it's a little bit of a new idea within the private sector that this is important, but also because it's hard to engineer that cultural shift. Making sure that these issues are woven into the fabric of your organization is no small thing. And it's hard to change all of the different aspects that create inequity, that suppress diversity, and that prevent inclusion within your organization. What's one of the biggest roadblocks to a successful DE&I initiative? In my perspective as a psychologist, obviously, put my psychologist hat on, it's humans' unconscious biases. So let's dig a little deeper into what we mean by that. What's standing in our way? In the race to boost DE&I efforts, humans' unconscious biases are a serious roadblock. What do I mean? Let's go all the way back to 1998. In 1998, 3 psychologists got together, Tony Greenwald, Mahzarin Banaji, and Brian Nosek, and they formed something called Project Implicit. These 3 psychologists dreamed up something called the AIT, which is the Implicit Attitudes Test. This is something some of you might have heard of, been familiar with already. At the time, this test was groundbreaking because it tapped into the speed of humans' biases in an undeniable way by measuring the strength of positive and negative associations with different demographic categories. So for example, putting words that referenced being female names, and then putting things about being intelligent or being smart. It's much easier for people to click a button when there's a female name and an adjective that means smart on the opposite side of the screen. It's easier for them to associate being smart with being male rather than being female. It was also groundbreaking at the time because it was on the internet, which was complete novelty, so that you were really able to tap into a broad-based population to complete this IAT. And the insights that came out of it were fascinating. The insights were that human biases are really pervasive and universal. It's not just men that associate being smart with being male. It's also women. And in a lot of cases, if you ask people if they have these biases, the answer is going to be no. So humans have these unconscious biases. They're hardwired into us, and we're not even aware that it's happening, even if it's actually impacting us negatively. As a woman, I don't want to be seen as less intelligent, but that doesn't mean that I haven't internalized that bias in my thinking and that I don't then associate that bias with my own gender. So why is this such a problem? And what is it that they're good for? Why have we wired in these biases? Because they help us choose. In our lives as humans, we're faced with an incredible amount of choices. We have an incredible amount of choices to make every single day. These biases help us to get there a little faster. They're shortcuts. So I've got 50 or so biases up on this slide just to give you a sense of how many there are. But at last count in the psychology literature, I think it's about 200 biases that they've cataloged. These are just some of the most prominent. So why are these biases there? Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman did groundbreaking work on this in the 1970s, work that later won Kahneman the Nobel Prize. What they focused on was that these biases are shortcuts for decision making, but that they also lead us to typically flawed choices. What do the shortcuts do? They simply smooth the way for making decisions that we feel good about. So it's not that they help us make good decisions, it's that they help us make decisions that feel good. How does this impact HR? Biases help us choose, not just in life, but also in HR. Think about what we just talked about on the last slide for a minute. Think about the way a recruiter might traditionally explain a call on who to hire, the language that they might use. The interview felt good, or the fit felt right. Recruiters traditionally have relied on biases and shortcuts to figure out who to hire. Many of them are automatic, and they don't even have access to the fact that they're using them. That leads them to make decisions that feel good, but not necessarily to decisions that are good. Another couple of psychologists, Anderson and Shackleton, talked about just this in the context of HR in a 1993 book on successful selection interviewing. There are so many biases baked into the HR process because we need to choose who to hire and who to promote. But if you look at the statistics on how well things like phone screens and resume reviewing do about choosing who to hire, you start to understand why humans aren't great at it. There's simply not enough time in a typical recruiter-applicant interaction, such as a phone screen or an interview review, to use anything except a shortcut to get a feel for the candidate's fit. These mechanisms in HR let humans go with their gut, their shortcuts, and yes, their biases. So how do we remove the human bias from the HR process? To put on my data scientist hat now, of all the hats, you really need to embrace AI technology. You need to let technology be part of the solution to fix what is a fundamentally human problem. You need to let AI in to help you address this idea of unconscious bias. Because for humans, those biases are really hard to eradicate because, again, they are unconscious for the most part. This is not something that people are doing consciously in the recruiting process. This is something that's baked into the way that they evaluate people, especially when they're pressed for time. So what prevents us as humans from wholeheartedly embracing AI tech? When we talked about in that last poll, if you had a roadblock embracing DE&I, my guess is that you've had a few roadblocks in trying to embrace AI tech as well in your organization. Why is that? What's so off-putting about AI technology? People tend to have a sort of gut reaction to the idea of bringing in AI technology, especially to an HR space, to solve what's considered a very human problem. When I talk about these sticking points, for me, they fall into two main categories. You can think of them sort of as twin poles here. The first is not enough humanity, and the second is too much humanity. So on one side, you've got that ick factor of, I don't want robots running the world. I don't want a robot overlord. What do they know about what we're doing? And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the idea of engineering stupidity, that you don't want to build in what's the worst parts of human decision-making into a machine. That humans may be stupid in some cases, but they're also really smart in others. And that if you have AI technology just picking pieces of what humans do, that you might have the problem of building a system that's even worse than whatever humans are doing right now. AI basically has an optics issue. It has these two sides of the spectrum in terms of concerns. And it's really hard to be able to push past this traditionally, not just within the private sector, but in general in society. So quick poll again for you. Are you concerned about AI being not human enough or it being too human? What's the worry from your perspective here? Okay, by a landslide, not human enough. This is a great insight to have in terms of how AI is seen in the HR space. In terms of it being not human enough, that doesn't surprise me because HR, right? Human resources. This is an area of an organization that prides itself, and rightfully so, on its humanity. In my experience as a representative of Cangrade working with our clients, that's a very, very common concern, especially when you get down to the individual recruiter level. These are folks that thrive in a job and in an organization that requires them to make human connections. And the idea that a robot, so to speak, might be able to do that better seems unlikely and, quite frankly, a little concerning to a lot of folks. So I'm going to try to convince you that there is a way to do AI right, that those concerns are well-founded and will serve you well when you're evaluating your AI technology solutions. But that if not all AI is created equal, and if you're able to focus on ethical AI technology in particular, you're going to find that those concerns will be alleviated. So what do we mean by ethical AI? Google has done a lot of work defining what ethical AI means and how organizations who develop AI technology should be thinking about it and holding themselves accountable. You can question whether Google themselves is doing that or not, but these are their guiding principles, at least. According to their team of thought leaders at Google, ethical AI is a lot of different things. First of all, it's unbiased. So this is what we were talking about in terms of not engineering human stupidity, right? We don't want to engineer unconscious biases into our AI in any way. Ethical AI is also beneficial. It should serve some sort of purpose or create some sort of greater good for the society. It's safe. It shouldn't be doing any harm. Ethical AI is also accountable. It's not something that has free reign to just operate however it wants with no oversight. Those oversight mechanisms need to be built in. It's also private. It alleviates any data concerns or security sharing issues. And lastly, and from my perspective as a scientist, most importantly, it's scientific. In the HR space, there is a lot of different kinds of technology being thrown at you on a regular basis, and a lot of different AI technology on top of that. Consequently, there's a lot of junk science out there. And it's hard as someone who's in the HR space in particular and doesn't necessarily have a scientific background to be able to evaluate all these different providers for all the different kinds of technology you need to employ to do your job well. So again, one of my goals with this presentation today is to try to help you get over that hurdle where you feel confident evaluating some of the science behind the AI technology that you're being offered, so that you start to tease apart the differences in the different kinds of service providers for the technology that you need. Okay, so we zoomed out to the big picture of what ethical AI is, but what does this mean for DE&I initiatives in HR in particular? What does it mean to have ethical AI when you're talking about the talent management domain? To be ethical, DE&I AI tech for HR, say that 3 times fast, needs to avoid 3 key things: baked-in biases, one-size-fits-all approaches, and black box systems. We're going to go into each of these in a lot more detail, but these are the 3 things that you need to avoid in any sort of AI tech solution that you or your organization rolls out. And what I want is that this PowerPoint will help you to figure out how to deep dive in each of these aspects and ask probing questions of whatever the tech solution you're looking at to make sure that it's not falling into any one of these 3 traps. So let's dive into these in more detail and make you into a DE&I tech expert. Here's a first quote for a little bit of food for thought for you guys. This quote is from Professor Mills. She ran the US Small Business Administration from 2009 to 13, and she says the following: "If we're not thoughtful and careful, we're going to end up with redlining again." What Professor Mills is warning us about here is a common practice, especially in the financial world, that codifies racial and ethnic biases into issues such as discriminatory lending practices. This has been a gigantic legal issue that's faced especially the financial sector, but businesses in general. What Professor Mills is worried about is that AI is going to end up bringing us right back to where we were. What's she concerned about? It's that other pole that you guys were a little less worried about, of engineering stupidity. She's worried that we are going to hardwire into our artificial intelligence the kinds of discriminations that humans can do as a one-off, but machines have the capability to automate and spread in a pervasive manner. So this leads us to pitfall number 1, the idea of having baked-in biases. Unethical AI embeds inequity into the HR system itself. Any given recruiter can have a greater or lesser level of unconscious or conscious biases. But if AI is built unethically, whether by bad science, sloppy science, bad data, it can be a much worse offender than humans. Why do I say that? If the interaction between humans and AI isn't managed carefully, the automation that's the backbone of any AI-driven solution will scale bias much more rapidly and pervasively. Humans are one-time offenders. AI solutions have the capacity to create an entire biased system. So here's a few real-life examples of that. An algorithm that was used on more than 200 million people in US hospitals to predict which patients would likely need extra medical care was shown to heavily favor white patients over Black patients, even though ethnicity was not a factor when they trained that algorithm. The algorithm used in the US court systems to predict the likelihood that a defendant would offend again predicted twice as many false positives for repeat offenders for Black defendants than for white defendants. In the business world, most recently, Amazon realized that their hiring algorithm was actually biased against women because they had trained the algorithm on a data set that contained mostly high-achieving men. The idea that biases might be baked into the data that you're training your model of is a real danger. So how do we build unbiased AI? We need to start with good data. It's really important to be choosy with the data that your AI learns on. You need to make sure that the data itself is bias-free. Make sure that any AI tool that you're going to use is using good data so as not to codify the biases that humans bring to work with them. Something I say a lot when I'm talking about data science in general is that bad data is always worse than no data. At least when you have no data, you recognize that you need to be more data-driven. You recognize that your decisions may not have a basis in anything but conjecture or anecdote or opinion. When you have bad data, you're assuming you're making good, data-driven, objective choices, when really the opposite may be true. Here's another quote for you. This one comes from Professor Furman, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2013 to 17 and served as an economic advisor to the World Bank. He says, I wouldn't have a central AI group that has a division that does cars. I would have the car people have a division of people who are really good at AI. So what does he mean here? He's saying that he wants AI to sit within a domain of expertise, not for the AI to sit as an umbrella and have offshoots into different domains from there. Professor Furman, you might say, is a leading expert on driving ROI. And the reason he's arguing for this is because he thinks that this is how AI tech can drive ROI for organizations. That AI tech is most impactful and most effective when it's actually domain driven. So this leads us to our second pitfall, our second thing to avoid. One size fits all solutions. Unethical AI will act as the universal solution for everything. AI solutions that claim to be the answer to life, the universe, and everything are bound to fall flat. There's a reason for the expression jack of all trades and master of none. Artificial intelligence and human intelligence are just very different things. Human intelligence is almost always broad-reaching and generalizable. But I, along with other data scientists, would argue that artificial intelligence is at its best when its brain power, so to speak, is concentrated at solving one very specific problem. Why is this? AI is a simulation of human intelligence, and it takes quite a lot of expertise and learning to build well. It's hard to simulate what humans do. It's hard to build that into an algorithm. And we need to make sure that the experts in the domain space are building an algorithm that is specifically designed to work in that space. The danger, if that's not the case, is that it doesn't do anything particularly well, which is not very helpful when you have a specifically constrained domain like HR, where you don't care if your AI can drive a car, you care if it will help you hire the right person for a role. So how do we build targeted AI? Pretty simple. Narrow the focus. There's a term in data science known as narrow AI. I don't know if you guys have heard that term before. It's also sometimes referred to as weak AI traditionally. This is in contrast to more strong AI, generalizable systems. But as I talked about in the last slide, Most data scientists will tell you that narrow AI is anything but weak. Narrow AI, for example, powers your email spam filter, your Netflix queue, and even the technology behind self-driving cars. I'd argue that if you're sitting in a self-driving car, you don't want a generalizable AI system driving that car for you. You'd much prefer to have an AI system that was designed only to keep that car in its lane and on the road. So why is it that narrow AI systems are so wonderful? Why is it that I'm so hyped on these systems? Narrow AI is able to analyze and interpret data with incredible amounts of accuracy and a much faster speed than human beings can. It can help humans to make better data-driven decisions and also take some of the burden of those monotonous tasks that we have to do. These two things are both of the key aspects that underlie any great HR tech solution. You need to aim your tech at what it's actually good at. You need to make sure that your AI is designed to do exactly what you need it to do, and that it's not interfering with the parts that humans actually excel in. Take an example from the robotics world. A delivery robot designed by a team at Carnegie Mellon can go greet visitors in the lobby, take them upstairs, or just transport mail from one place to another. Things that humans don't love doing and robots are great at. Unfortunately, this robot has a problem. It's got no arms. So it can't pick up the mail, shake the visitor's hand, or push the elevator buttons to go upstairs. Luckily, humans are great at arms and button pushing. So what does the robot do? It asks someone nicely to put the mail in its basket, to follow it upstairs, or to push the elevator button when it gets there. When AI and humans stay in the lanes that they excel in, everybody wins. This is the case for HR evaluative tasks as well. Narrow AI is great at grunt work and sifting through thousands of candidates. My guess is your HR team is not a fan of those things and would prefer to focus on building those human connections and generating unique insights from face-to-face interviews, which conversely is not a situation where narrow AI would be at its best. By leveraging the things that humans are great at and AI is great at, you're able to build a better product together. Here's one last quote for you to think on. This one's from Professor Sandal, who's a thought leader on the morality concerns that are packed into economic policies and systems. Professor Sandal says, "Can smart machines outthink us, or are certain elements of human judgment indispensable in deciding some of the most important things in life?" This is a little bit of a rhetorical question, a classic philosopher you have here. What he's worried about is exactly that ick factor that 80+% of you mentioned being concerning in the beginning as well. He's worried that AI is crowding out the role for humans in making choices. He's urging companies to think seriously about the ethical dimensions of what they're doing, and also us as active consumers to participate in that conversation about ethicality. I'm encouraging you to do the same thing in your organizations with the tech solutions you're evaluating. I'm encouraging you to be an active participant in keeping those AI tech providers honest and making sure that their solutions are ethical. Overall, what Professor Sandal wants, and what I think any good AI tech solution should agree with, is to reserve a lane for humans to shine and to figure out what lane that is. So that brings us to pitfall number 3, black box systems. Unethical AI lacks transparency. Unfortunately, there are a lot of AI systems that fall into this trap. These systems are known in the data science world as opaque because it's difficult to see what is actually going on inside of them. Why are they making the choices they're making? And how do you understand what's happening? This makes course correction difficult. When AI isn't transparent, it's really difficult for us as humans to trust it, especially if it's shown to produce an unexpected, problematic, or incorrect answer. In the HR space, you're particularly vulnerable to this concern because of issues of legal defensibility. If you can't articulate why a candidate has been rejected from your application process, that leaves you vulnerable to a legal challenge from that individual. So be wary of solutions where they cannot or will not explain the science that goes into it, or where the output isn't easy to read and understand. Don't just let them convince you that it's very fancy science that's above your pay grade and it doesn't really matter because the answer is going to be right in the end. If you can't understand what the AI is doing, then neither can your candidates, and neither can a court of law. Transparency is a means to an end. So let's do one more quick poll. How many of your team members do you think would push back on bringing AI into your HR process? All right, some of them. So this one's a little more evenly distributed. It looks like you're getting a little resistance depending on who it is that's on your team. So most people are going to see some resistance. My hope is that some of the slides we've gone through today will help you combat some of that resistance by making sure the AI tech solution isn't exacerbating those problems. So how do we build interactive AI that's transparent, that's not a black box? AI doesn't have to be confusing, and it doesn't have to be opaque. It can be collaborative. AI has the ability to radically alter how work gets done and who does it. And the larger impact should be in complementing and augmenting human capabilities, not replacing them. So what's the solution here? We need to make sure we're trading insights. To take full advantage of this collaboration with AI, companies need to understand how humans can most effectively augment machines and vice versa. AI helps humans expand their abilities by amplifying our strengths, extending our capabilities, and freeing up our time. But humans also need to do their part to support AI in return. They need to help AI train to perform its tasks. They need to be able to explain the outcomes of these tasks to relevant stakeholders, and sometimes to the AI itself. And they need to have that level of oversight to ensure that these tasks are being completed responsibly. So the relationship between humans and their AI is no different from any other strictly human relationship. Communication between AI and humans is key to doing it well. You need to keep the lines of communication open between humans and AI. Give humans insight into what the AI is doing and make sure that AI in return can learn from the insights that humans are generating along the way. So here's a summary of what we've learned today before we dive into your questions. There's 3 things that ethical AI needs to be: unbiased, targeted, and interactive. And there's 3 ways to get there: starting with good data, keeping your focus narrow, and trading insights between AI and humans. Obviously, here at Cangrade, my home organization, that's something that we focus on a lot. When we were building our solution, because we're a scientist-led organization, we spent a lot of time trying to get that technology right, trying to make sure that we engineered the AI in a way that achieves all of these 3 aims that are so critical. You're going to see a lot of different AI tech solutions, depending on whether it's for hiring, for promotion, for professional development. And my goal here today is just that you make sure you're always asking these questions of whatever provider is trying to sell you their tech, that you hold them accountable and make sure that their AI tech has the ethicality that you need to push your DE&I initiatives forward for your organization. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Sarah, I don't know what's popped up from
Yes, so
folks.
let me jump into our first one right here. So this person's hesitant to use technology to help with DE&I. Do you have tips for overcoming that? How do you get your team to acknowledge that they should get a technology to help with this?
That's a great question. So I think the easiest place to start is always by acknowledging pain points, having folks come together and agree on things that are tough for them as a team. So even if you can't agree on a solution right away, it helps to agree on what the problem is. Once you've talked about the problem, then you can start to brainstorm solutions, and then you can push tech or AI as a potential solution to a particular problem. But it helps to have that problem agreed on as a baseline and have a consensus around what the most important problem is before you put forward something as a solution.
Great. I'll hop into our next one here. So on the flip side, this person has software in place already to help their team combat bias in hiring, but their team isn't bought into using it. How would you get them to believe that it's there to help them, not take their jobs?
That's a great question. So I think this question gets at that idea of the ick factor, and more importantly, gets at the idea that the robots are coming for your jobs, right? So that's something that nobody wants to feel. It also can feel, in my experience working with HR professionals, you can get that pushback of it feels a little devaluing of their expertise. That, you have folks that have been recruiting for 10, 20 years, and they feel like by bringing in a robot to do their job, that it's devaluing the expertise that they've amassed. And I would say that, again, you want to go back to that idea that I talked about earlier in the presentation, that AI has a lane and humans have a lane too. That tech should be aimed at what it's actually good at, and humans should keep doing what they're actually good at. It goes back to this question from Professor Sandal about what is it that's sacred for human decision making and human judgment. What we talked about is that there's a lot of things that humans are really great at. Most notably, spending time deep diving on an interview type of basis about whether this person has the right fit for your organization. All that AI tech should be replacing in your talent management process, in the hiring funnel, at least in the beginning, is that first level of grunt work. That it would be a hard sell to my imagination to imagine that recruiters love sifting through a pile of thousands of resumes. And so the pitch that I always encourage folks to use when they get pushback from internally from their team is, hey, all we want to do is bring in technology to do the parts of your job that are annoying and time consuming and not that fun. And we want to leave you to do all the parts of your job that you're fantastic at. We want to use AI in a collaborative way to help you shine even brighter in your role, not to diminish the need for you to be there.
Great. And a question here from Katie is, can you give an example about how implementing a targeted AI drove specific desired outcomes for a company's DE&I initiatives, for example, higher representation of specific communities, et cetera?
That's a great question. So I can use the example of one of our clients at Cangrade, where we were able to roll out a pre-hire solution for them. So our technology is designed to make sure that you're screening people with soft skills as the first touch in your funnel. And what that does is it's able to preserve the diversity in your funnel. So one of our clients used this as a first touch solution. They had been using another provider that was much later in the funnel and focused more on hard skills. Then they switched to Cangrade as a provider. They used us right up front. So the first thing after you said, yes, I want to apply to a job, you were thrown into Cangrade's soft skills assessment. What that did is it preserved all of the great diversity that was already in their funnel that wouldn't necessarily have made it to the interview stage. So by that, I mean not just demographic categories, not just ethnicity, gender, and so on, but even just different ways of thinking about how to do the job, different numbers of years of experience, different kinds of educational backgrounds. When you're not using resume screening or hard skills as that first touch, it eliminates a lot of the unconscious bias that's built into that hiring pipeline. And by the time you get to that interview stage, you can dig down on, whether they have specific skills that you need and so on and so forth. But the feedback we got from the recruiters at this organization is that they were thrilled to see how many different kinds of candidates were already there. A lot of times you have organizations concerned about diversity as a sourcing issue. What you hear as pushback from organizations a lot is, we'd love to hire more women, they're just not applying for these jobs. And what I would argue is that there likely are more women applying for the jobs, but they're getting screened out because the way that you are evaluating them is broken. You see this a lot on LinkedIn these days with postings about DE&I jobs in and of themselves. A lot of organizations are asking for a decade plus experience in launching or managing DE&I initiatives. Now, this is a problem because DE&I hasn't really existed as a concept in the private sector in a pervasive way for more than a few years at best. So by prioritizing this sort of hard skill, you're more likely to get some sort of consultant that's been working in this space since before it was very popular, which means, quite frankly, you're more likely to end up with a white man. That defeats the purpose of trying to preserve diversity in the funnel. So again, by focusing on soft skills, it evens the playing field. And that's one of the things that we do at Cangrade, but something that other tech companies will focus on as well.
Okay, we're at the top of the hour here, ladies. Thank you so much, Leanna and Sarah as well, for assisting with the Q&A. And thank you everyone for joining us. Whenever I close the session, it's going to prompt an exit survey to open in a new browser. So just take some time to fill that out, just a brief moment before you hop into your next session, as your feedback is important to us and the folks at Cangrade. We'll have this archived on hr.com, as well as your credit information. Your credit will appear in your hr.com account within 2 business days, and we'll also send an email with that information. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Leanna. Absolutely wonderful content and great presentation. Thanks, everyone, and take care.
Thanks, Linda.